Well, this is indeed a good turnout. In large part, we've now received the fire regulations for number of people in this room, and we're breaking the law. Yeah. And the reason that we only started with 80 chairs in here is because I said there couldn't be any more than 80 people showing up. As an economist, making predictions about the future, and they're wrong in what we do best. Now, I'm going to talk about the corporation as a going concern and a person in a historical perspective. My lecture is boring. We have the exciting lecture from Professor Black, which is much more exciting than my boring history stuff. So, when you fall asleep, don't fall on the chairs, stay around for Professor Black. It's not working. It's not working. I can't move the Okay. I can talk about it, but I don't think I did an outline of what I was talking about up there. I'm going to start with what do we mean by business enterprise in terms of what we call a going concern. Got to think about the enterprise itself before we start talking about persons and things like that. So what do we mean by business enterprise as a going concern? Going concern is the conception that the enterprise in a sense, has the capability of indefinite activity. What I mean by this, it has productive capability which enables it to engage in economic activity year after year after year. As long as that is intact, then the enterprise can continue on its particular way. But there's more to the enterprise than simply productive capability. The second part happens to be its capability of engaging in business. And what we mean by this is that it can set prices, it can raise revenue, it can engage in financial activities, but the point is it generates money so that the enterprise can hire labor, pay stockholders, get profits, etc. That's the business side. That's separate from the plant side or the technological side of it. So that's what we mean by going concern. It has both the managerial and plant capabilities to have an indefinite lifespan, more or less. And we're going to call those, when you put them together, the going enterprise. Now the question is, what's the role of the going enterprise in capitalism? What we want to talk about is, first of all, the enterprise is a locus of economic activity which is independent of something else. That is, it's a self-contained, I won't say machine, but a self-contained organization that can produce goods and services, sell them, get money, and do it over and over again. And those who are inside the enterprise are capable of directing it how they want. So the enterprise is a locus of economic activity controlled by its owners. Now, what this is supposed to do is provide the owners with lots of income. That's the proposal thing about enterprises is that they provide profits for owners. Otherwise, why undertake it? So it's designed to provide a continuous income stream for owners. And anything which enhances that capability is considered something good for the enterprise. But the enterprise is centered on the individual, that is the owner. In some sense, separate from society. It's a locus within society, but is in fact separate from it. So if you think of an enterprise in that particular way, then as long as they're not violating any laws, who cares about whether that's socially good things or not? It's not designed to do that. It's an entity in and of itself, but it's separated from society. It's an individual. Think of an individual as a methodological individual, as a separate individual from in society. So we have this enterprise, this going concern. The question is, what are personalities? This is interesting because people don't generally think that enterprise has personalities until we turn them into people. And so this is where we turn them into people. If you think of an enterprise, at least in, say, 1800, the enterprise was generally thought of in terms of a proprietorship that is identified with a single or a few individuals. and the enterprise extended no further beyond than those individuals. Those individuals have rights, private rights. Then they don't have to, in fact, engage in socially responsible or publicly responsible activity. Individuals do not have to do that. So, the enterprise has private rights, no necessary social obligations whatsoever, or public interest obligations. This is important because we would then, in a sense, enterprises are not constrained to do something good or right. They are not constrained not to pollute rivers if there's no laws against pollution. We expect enterprises to do that. This understands the nature of an enterprise under a capitalist system. So that's the first part. The second part is that relationship with workers. If you were in a feudal society, the lord would actually have some social responsibility for the peasants. Under capitalism, the enterprise has no social responsibility towards workers in terms of safety or health. That is, if they do something in the context of the law and they get killed, that's it. Now, that was the rules that were set up in the 1800s. It's been somewhat changed in more recent times. That's just by getting the corporation or the enterprise to be responsible for worker safety and health. The first part about health is about polluting rivers, things like that. But initially in the 1800s, when all this was being set up, they did not have those responsibilities. If a worker came into a dangerous job, he accepted that implicitly when he agreed to do the job. If he got killed by a dangerous machine, that was his fault. The second one is that the enterprise promotes wage dependency. That is, workers have no other alternative but to earn wages. And at the same time, even though they have wage dependency, it's without any social obligation. So workers have no place else to go but to sell their labor power to an enterprise, and then there's a downturn. The enterprise is not responsible if they're laid off. They starve to death, it's not their responsibility. So the notion of a lack of social responsibility to workers who have no place to go but to sell their labor power disappears in the 1800s. A series of laws, a series of court cases which made this quite obvious. So, with that, what is a going enterprise? What is this designed to do? I would argue that the going enterprise, as a core conception, has embedded in it a notion of an organization that is designed for corporate wealth accumulation and reaccumulation of power. Now, this becomes much more, I would say, much more the case when we have the emergence of the corporation. Now, let's briefly look at the emergence of the corporation. If we have a going enterprise, what's the relationship of that enterprise to something beyond and independent of the owners? And that's what a corporation is. It's something that's independent and extends beyond the lives of owners. In this case, the way you set that up is have a corporation. A corporation is an enterprise that's in perpetuity, doesn't live or die with owners. And of course, what it has is shareholders. What else is important about this corporation? That the shareholders have limited liability. They only lose what they put in. They don't actually take all the wealth that the owners have, only what they put in. Which means that owners can accumulate wealth out of the enterprise, of a corporate enterprise, put it in their own private wealth holdings, and if the enterprise goes bankrupt, you can't go back to the owners and shareholders to get it. So limited liability becomes a very good way to acquire wealth and hold on to it. And as I say in the last part, the corporate enterprise becomes much more purely a vehicle for the concentration of the capitalist class. That is, making the capitalist class smaller and smaller, in which they hold greater and greater amounts of wealth. So that's in a sense the enterprise. Now let us turn to the going corporation. Now we have a lot of issues here. We have a corporation which has lots of shareholders. What are these shareholders? I mean, what's the relation of the shareholders to the corporation? Do the shareholders actually own the output of the corporation? Do they own its property? Can they be assured that they get part of its profit, get it direct its profit. What can the shareholders do, that is, since the owners of the corporation, what can they do vis-a-vis the corporation? What we find out, starting somewhere around 1820s, a progressive development of the separation of shareholders' ownership of the corporation and the corporation itself. So, for example, the corporation owns the output. The shareholders do not. They have no rights to the output. And of course, they have no right to the income derived from selling that output or from the profit stream that emerges out of it. They have no rights to it. That is, they can't own it. They can't say that's my part of it. This becomes very clear when, in the case of 1865, the corporation made it very clear that the corporation owns the plant and equipment. So if you own shares in a company, you can't say, well, that steel mill is mine. It belongs to the corporation itself. And moreover, the corporation carries out market transactions in its own name. So what we're looking at is a corporation looking like an old-fashioned individual undertaking economic activity. The individual proprietor who owned the plant, Now the corporations own the plant. We're making the corporation like that individual proprietor of earlier times, moving toward the notion of a personhood for a corporation. How much time do I have?
All you want.
No, we only have until 9 o'clock. That's the problem. Bill wants to take 4 hours. Okay. I'm going to run a little bit. Okay. Okay. Managing the corporation. Management represents the shareholders and is presumed to carry out actions on their behalf. This is how the courts look at it. So you can't sue management unless you can say that they've done something illegal in and of themselves. If you want to go after management, you have to actually go after the corporation, not the management. This, again, makes the corporation like a person. The corporation acts on its own, that is, it carries out its own activities, and the corporation, rather than the shareholder, is the agent in all, or agent or person in all cases of litigation. Again, what we're saying is that we have management who drives the corporation and it represents the shareholders, but the corporation is an entity in and of itself from which management can direct it. Again, you're making the corporation like an individual in a proprietorship. That's what we're looking at. And as long as you want to equate an enterprise to, any kind of enterprise to a proprietorship, then you're going to result in making any kind of enterprise like a person. So, now, what we have is that all these people own the corporation, but the corporation has to act as its ongoing enterprise, its ongoing concern. It has to act by itself. So, the way to do that, well, we have to resolve this notion of personhood. We've been talking about personhood. There's a couple of different viewpoints, all of them since 1809. First of all, a corporation is an association of persons, basically shareholders. Later, by 1844, it becomes an artificial person, and then by the late 1870s, it becomes a person. These are all driven there to try to deal with the issue, how do you deal with multiplicity of owners of shares and the corporation acting as a going enterprise in its own right? If you conceive of the corporation as a holistic collective entity by its own right, then you have a problem with the issue of multiple ownership, and the way the courts redressed it is to move progressively towards the corporation as a person. And by the late 1800s, we find that in place. But it's something which has taken place over the last, virtually most of the 19th century. Yeah. So what's the legal personality of this corporation? Because now we got it as a person. Well, first of all, it has private rights like people. If you're going to make it, if you think the corporation is something, then it's going to have private rights. And this comes out with a court case in 1819, which makes the corporation like a person which has private rights. In this case, Dartmouth had in a statute that it had to do some public service stuff, had to be in the public interest. The trustees of Dartmouth didn't like this because they got their statute from whatever Dartmouth is in, what, Connecticut? No, New Hampshire. New Hampshire. They didn't like it, so they went to court. And the court said, oh yes, just because you're a corporation doesn't mean that you actually have to carry out public service. You have private rights. This is 1819. Now, this notion of private rights means that local or state control of corporation is constrained because we are like private people. Corporations, the state and the federal government cannot impose certain things on you because you're a private individual. This comes out clearly in the 14th Amendment, which was taken over by corporations to make themselves first people in a more direct way, but also the Santa Clara case is well known. But the Santa Clara case actually didn't talk about person versus state because they simply relied on previous description of the artificial person and things like that. But the point is, the corporation becomes more and more so over the 19th century as an entity which has private rights like people. This just means that federal government laws override state laws regarding the conduct of corporations. So you have a state saying, well, we have to have, your corporation must produce unleaded gasoline. The state actually probably can't impose that upon your federal government overturn. So the interest of the local community or the state has been severely restricted in this particular way. Just like you can't discriminate based on religion, race, or anything else, even if the state said you could. So the point is federal rights trump state and local rights, or local issues. So basically, the legal personality corporation is that it can do almost anything that an individual person can do. Although in recent years, that is since about the 1940s, there's been some arguments that the state and federal government can regulate the corporation in terms of economic activity in the public interest, but these are health and safety. We're not talking about controlling prices, what they produce, or how they invest, which is actually the most important thing for us. But it's health and safety issues. Now, that gives you an idea of this kind of legal personality of the corporation. However, what we have to realize is that the role of the corporation in becoming a person was not because they wanted to become a person, it was that the corporation does things. And what it does is that it controls markets and recreates markets in their own interest. But to be able to do that, it has to become large. It has to be able to buy up competitors, run them out of business. Now the question is, if it wants to do this, is there any legal sanction against it? If there was, then the corporation would have a problematical legal foundation. So let's start with the notion of corporations and mergers. Corporation laws in a particular state may say that the corporation, when it's become incorporated, cannot buy up any other corporation in the state, not to mention outside the state. That started changing, from the 1860s onward. But you have that. So corporations are constrained by the corporation statutes, and if they violate it, then they have this ultra-virus doctrine which dissolves the corporation. That case was a fairly powerful tool, but never really got used the way it should have in the latter part of the 19th century. Now this moves us on to local and national markets and foreign corporations. A foreign corporation is a corporation incorporated outside the state operates in your state. That's a foreign corporation, just like a foreign country. The question is, can they do so, or can the state regulate them? Well, in fact, foreign corporations in local and state markets from the 1830s and 1870s could in fact be regulated by local statutes. That is, I don't like you, Singer sewing machine company. I'm going to put a big tax on you to make sure you can't sell sewing machines in Missouri, and because we want to have a local sewing machine company sell them, or produce and sell them. Well, that could have been done between 1830 and 1870. However, the other one is that can a corporation in a foreign country or in a foreign state own property in your state? You say that's illegal, and therefore they can't do that. Of course, you can say your own corporation can't own property in other states. Now, What all this does is break up the national market, one can conceive of it, or preventing the national market from emerging. The court system in the United States was an activist court system. And in conservative, the courts in the past were not activists. It's a lie, because at this time they were entirely active. They wanted to create not only a corporate America, but also an America that's a national America, not a regional or a local America. So, through a series of court cases, they basically said, you cannot discriminate against a foreign corporation in your state. Which means that this corporation can extend to the entire country, create a national market with no local restrictions on them. In the various court cases we have there. And eventually, by the 1920s, a foreign corporation is considered as a person in that state, and as a person, not as a corporation, as a person. That's how the law, that's how the decision came down, as a person in that state, and they cannot be expelled arbitrarily. Basically, the corporations have free hand. This is all from the national level. Now that's, by this context, basically the foundation for the corporation being able to become national, own property across states, engage across states in a variety of ways. Has a foundation, which means that there is a more substantive foundation for the corporation itself to exist. The final point that I want to talk about is size and market control. 1870s and 80s, there were lots of problems in American markets, a lot of price competition. You had to bring control and stability to those markets. A variety of ways were invented to do so. The corporation with merging became the preferred method after the Sherman Act in 1890. But how you merge to deal with the problem of control, to deal with markets, you have to be a bit, you have to work at it. This can merge anyway. Standard Oil got broken up in 1911 because when it merged with all the other oil companies, it didn't consolidate them, didn't restructure itself and say that we got economies of scale and it's much more efficient. They just ran it like a bunch of independent enterprises under a single umbrella, like the trade association, which is illegal. Okay. However, so you can't do it that way. U.S. versus Winslow dealt with merger, but consolidation and efficiency. That's perfectly fine. Even though the enterprise, this is huge machinery, came out to about 80% control of the market. But this is perfectly fine. But it still looks like, maybe if it got all of it, that would still be bad. 1920, Supreme Court came down and said, business is not per se bad. This means that large corporations, the ones that have all the money, are not necessarily bad. You have to prove that they've done something wrong, but they're per se not bad. A big step. Which means that the corporation actually has no, it's completely without enemies within the state. And finally, the last one, in terms of controlling markets, in the International Harvester case, said that the corporation is big and dominant and control markets can set a price, and if other people follow that, that's fine. That's not price fixing. So it means that the corporation, by this time, 1930, has all the legal foundation, all the economic capabilities to dominate markets, and control the economy of our society. This is, in a sense, somewhat independent of being a person, but it goes along both sides of it. So not just simply being a person is all the issue. It's also being an entity which cannot be challenged. If you challenge the corporation in any particular fundamental way, use that challenge how society or the economic system is controlled, run, and directed. And that is a big order. So if you think about trying to change corporation from being a person to a non-person, there's a lot of things you got to deal with. But what you're going to threaten them with is their loss of control of economic activity in society. And that's what they're going to fight for. Thank you.